Good morning.
Hello there, Peter. How are you?
Well, if I suddenly vanish, there are massive electrical storms moving into the area. So hopefully it won't get too bad and I'll be able to stay online, but I might have a power failure if it goes. So,
Yeah, okay. That sounds kind of scary.
yeah, and it's pitch black. The webcam wouldn't even be viewable today.
Uh,
It actually looks like it's 11 p.m. in the house now.
you are in
It's
Manhattan, right?
Westchester. So I'm an hour north of Manhattan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know where that is, of course. Syracuse, Syracuse wise. So,
Beloved
yeah.
alma mater.
Oh, here's Kent. Excellent. Hello.
Hello.
Did you get the time wrong, or did you think I was overly engaged and organized and would be early?
Oh, what time does it start?
Oh, it starts in 4 minutes.
Okay. I jumped in just to test to see because Fabian had sent me a link, but then I was just testing to see if it worked, and it did work. So I figured this was the link. So
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. I was rushing home and get this email that you had connected. It's like, oh, hang on, time differences. Where are you, by the way?
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, okay. It's crazy, isn't it? With this, Peter sitting just north of New York City. I'm sitting in Wimbledon, and you're in Oregon. So that's obviously Doug Engelbart land. So that's pretty cool.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Hmm.
Very strange. I don't know why Zoom isn't showing my standard background picture. Do you see a picture of me back there or no? I
No.
normally have a static photo and
We see you in text, which is appropriate.
very strange. Must be a Zoom bug.
Just checking this. Yeah, I've been to Oregon once, and it was because of Doug. He
Okay.
was born in Portland.
Okay. I didn't realize that.
This, yeah, he was just looking at Wikipedia here. Yeah, January 30, July 2nd. Yeah. Yeah, no, we went there. They turned some day into Doug Engelbart Day.
Okay.
Oh, wonderful.
Nice.
It was kind of informative for our community because I remember it was at the university there and everything was really nice. And then this one lady who has been listening to the Augmenting Humans and all of that good stuff presentation, she said, "You're clearly a man of great means. Would you consider a sizable donation to the university something?" And Doug had to say, "No, I have not made much money out of this. I'm sorry, I can't afford it." And the woman just left.
Hmm.
It's like such an expectation that having done well in tech, you have
Right.
tons of money.
Right. Right.
Uh, not that he did super badly. I mean, he had an incredible place in Atherton. Had he sold that, he could have done all kinds of things. But anyway,
Hmm.
days gone by.
Yeah, I met him in Pittsburgh back at Hypertext 98. One of the most fascinating conversations ever. Such a
Yeah,
great man.
that must have been really really good. So, Kent, hello.
Hello.
I've been reading up about what you've been doing, and Fabian has obviously talked about you. Do you want to give me an idea of what you'd like to do today, or ask us what we normally do, or what makes sense?
Well, I'm sort of in the process of taking this huge archive of interviews that I've done and adding a number of things. One is transcripts, but also taxonomy terms. And I thought I just should. I know that you've been talking about VR as a way of kind of exploring these things, and I've seen your um, Future of Tech Symposium and some of the work you've done in terms of creating these markups to be able to have more of a relational dynamic uh, to the text. And so I thought I'd just talk a little bit about what I'm doing and get some feedback in terms of other things that are maybe existing tools that are there.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi, Fabian. Hi, Mark. Good to see you.
Kent was just filling me in on his thoughts for the day, and it all sounds very relevant and wonderful. Leon is here too. In terms of timing, how long do you want to spend on? Okay, so obviously we do transcripts too. And the one thing that I've really learned with the transcript is they're always shit, no matter how you look at it. Speech and writing is not the same thing. So what we tried to do to alleviate that slightly, considering this forum is primarily on the future of text, is the speaker speaks properly and we'll edit removing so and all of that nonsense. That's not so hard. And then what we try to do afterwards is speak in chunks. And I'm not trying to be artificial. We've tried many artificial ways and it never works. But all I mean is if someone, usually Alan, who's not here at the moment, but he will usually come up with a bit of a soliloquy or something. And that is really encouraged in the community because it just becomes a lot easier to read later. So if you have any comments, if it's a small one, I'll probably delete it from the transcript now, and then maybe, just Kent continuing. We have to keep working on this as a community together. That's the first thing. The second thing is Leon and me have been doing a bit of emailing about Clipboard. So towards the end of the day, if we can have a brief discussion on that, basically copy and paste should be much more powerful. I just want to give you a heads up if we get time for that. So other than that, Kent, any questions from us or anything you want to say up front? Oh, sorry, I'm just turning my computer on Do Not Disturb. I'm a bit distracted. Here we go. No one can disturb us.
Okay. No, I mean, I could sort of dive into showing and talking a little bit about what I've been doing and some of the questions that I have as I move forward. But yeah, if you want me to go ahead and dive in, I can. And let me know if I can share my screen as well.
Yeah, that should be enabled.
Okay. So let's see. I will share my screen and let's see here. Okay, share my screen. All right, so I'm gonna just show a little bit of a higher level context of what I'm doing and then dive in and show a little bit about my podcast. But my name's Kent Bai. I do the Voices of VR podcast. And since 2014, May of 2014, so for over 9 years, I've attended well over 100 different events, both physical and virtual, of the virtual reality community. And I've recorded over 2,000 oral history interviews and published over 1,200 of those conversations on the Voices of VR podcast. So I've been tracking the evolution of the medium as it's been moving forward. And so I've got quite a data set of oral history testimony, and I wanted to come just speak to the future of text because I've started to get transcripts and thinking about, how to move from thinking about this as an object-oriented way and moving into something that I draw a lot of inspiration from process relational philosophy from Alfred North Whitehead. And I feel like there's a lot of similar threads that I see in the future of text where it's about drawing these associative links between different ideas or concepts, or maybe breaking up chunks of information and connecting them. Fabian and I have done some brainstorming over the years in terms of how to, there's this provocation of virtual reality and XR. And because I do a podcast, then the question is, okay, what is the immersive experience of the podcast that would make it compelling to actually have? I don't think that going into a WebXR experience and listening to an entire podcast is necessarily all that interesting. Most people, when they listen to podcasts, they're out and about, they're maybe washing dishes or in their car, they're doing something else where the audio is like a second augmented reality experience where they're doing other things and being engaged in the world. And so I've had difficult thinking about what would be the virtual reality experience that would make it way more compelling for people to just be in a virtual reality experience and then listen to an entire podcast. Maybe with generative AI, we'll get to the point where you're able to basically create an entire visual spectacle that's trying to metaphorically represent what's happening. But I think that's too difficult of a problem to start. And where I've been thinking a lot more lately is once you have transcripts and once you have a robust taxonomy to be able to categorize different things, then the XR experience could be thought of more as a place to discover new podcasts and maybe even discover relationships between different moments where people are talking to about the similar topic. So I wanted to show a couple of just slides here from a talk that I gave at South by Southwest called "The Ultimate Potential of VR: Promises and Perils," mostly because on my episode 1000, it was an opportunity for me to go back and say, okay, I've done, well, at that point, well over like 1,500 interviews, but I wanted to do like a 3-hour retrospective looking at what is the ultimate potential of VR. At the end of every one of my interviews that I do for the Voices of VR, I ask, what do you think the ultimate potential of VR is and what it might be able to enable? So I have a pretty vast repository of people thinking about the different potentials of VR. And some of those, and what I've been able to do with that is kind of map out the landscape of the human experience of these different contextual domains. And I'll sort of pull up one of the slides here. 1 second. Let me just go to, okay. So I'll share this. Let's see. Share, wait, let me just make sure, where's the presentation? Slideshow. Okay, here we go. So, so folks will say, they'll say that the ultimate potential is education or connecting with friends and family or, productivity or being able to or have medical applications or entertainment. And so basically there's all these variety of different contextual domains. And the challenge with any taxonomy is that it's either going to be consistent or complete. And so I've been trying to I've been using this, hold on, my monitor is blinking, okay. So the taxonomy is either going to be consistent or complete. And so, there's never going to be one singular taxonomy where you can sort of encompass all the different domains of human experience. This was my best approach of trying to create these different taxonomies and categories. And it's also had this connection to, say, ethics. I've been doing a lot of work in XR ethics where looking at the ethical and moral dilemmas of virtual reality. And I was a part of the IEEE Global Initiative on the Ethics of Extended Reality, where I gave this XR Ethics Manifesto presentation back in 2019. And essentially this is like an overview of just walking through all of these different ethical and moral dilemmas. And I realized there's a lot of like little bullet points on this slide, but this talk that I gave, the XR Ethics Manifesto, was then different folks at the IEEE Global Initiative saw it and said, hey, let's do a whole initiative to try to write some white papers. And so what we ended up doing was taking each of these different contextual domains and writing a white paper on different aspects of, say, medical XR or education in XR or metaverse and the governance or, identity and self. And so there's a way in which that these contextual domains both carry the promises and the perils. And the talk that I gave at South by Southwest is basically an elaboration of that for 50 minutes going into all that. And this is the slides that I'm showing here. I'm not going to go through that presentation here today just because it's, it's all, to be able to cover all the different potentials and perils of VR is like, it's a 50-minute presentation within itself. But I wanted to just give you this as background context as I am right now starting to go through my website, and I'm still in the process of doing that. Actually, like I'm probably about 200 episodes in, and this taxonomy that I have, if I go through here on the side, I have like these different higher level categories. And so if I go to like entertainment, and I can start to see like, gaming and interactivity, immersive storytelling, environmental storytelling, immersive art, music, dance, theater, live performance, creation tools, adult content, exercise, content creation tools, location-based entertainment, sports. So that's just even with the entertainment. Entertainment is probably the most robust of these, but for each of these, there's like these subcategories of different applications and different types of medical applications, ideas. So I've taken that ultimate potential of VR and started to categorize these different posts. But I think the main, so there's just to be able to see the Venn diagram of all the data, starting to kind of categorize at a high level. Now, the challenge that I've found is that, so this is just an example of an episode, and I've just got this working minutes ago, and I have a development site, but I'll probably be, after this conversation, be uploading my rough transcripts. But you can see, like, this is an example page of a podcast episode, and I have a traditional write-up. And then at the bottom here, I have this rough transcript, and I've been using WhisperX, which is a fork of Whisper, which is, I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with OpenAI's Whisper. Whisper does not do diarization out of the box. Diarization is the process of detecting speaker changes. And if you've done any work with that, then it puts it into an SRT format. An SRT format is basically made for video, like subtitles, and it's not really very human readable. And so I had to go through and create a script in Python to be able to collate it so that whenever there's a speaker change, it would put the speaker 1, speaker 2. And that this is another thing that I need to go through and do, which is, replace speaker 01 with like my name. And then here we can see speaker is, hi, I'm Katrina Sato. And then actually, I don't know if it's actually detect. So sometimes, okay, so let's go ahead and dive right in. My name is Jonah Gold. So here's an example where like the SRT file is not detecting like a speaker change. And so this speaker is, this is actually 2 speakers. And so the idea is that anytime you do a transcript, there's always going to be some level. And so I've created a pipeline where I can create the SRT files, but I would have to go in here and basically add a speaker change that may not be detected. So there's still a lot of tuning, and this is what I found with doing the transcripts is that the technology is always going to be progressing and getting better and better. But I found that there's always going to be some level of human intervention to be able to go in and correct it. And so what I've done on my website here is I have the major like posts that I have on all my podcasts. And then I've created an advanced custom field in WordPress that allows me to basically dump in whatever the transcript is. And I have with a WordPress API, the WordPress REST API, I can create a pipeline where I create the transcript, I parse it, and then I do all the different, like I'll need to go through and replace the speaker stuff. And if there's anything I need to go back and change, like right here, it's not showing the proper shift, then I need to go back and change it and then re-upload it. But once I re-upload it, it's not changing what's happening up here. So I'm trying to create a pipeline. So I'm using WordPress to be able to have my existing website, but to basically create this extra field and this rough transcript. And then once I have that rough transcript, the SRT file has the podcast or the information where the time code is there. And with this MEX, I'm using the Megaphone theme, and MEX has this ability so that it'll detect the whatever audio file is on the page. And then when I can create a JavaScript that's automatically in the script that I created to be able to basically click on this. And I don't know if the audio is going to come through, but if I click on it.
I'm Katrina Gold Saito, and I'm the co-creator of Reachu.
So I can go through and basically spot check and say, okay, this is speaker 2. Maybe you could each give a bit of context, and I click on it.
Maybe you could each give a bit more context as to your background and your journey.
So right now, I've created it so that I can start to spot check these transcripts. So I click here.
So I guess what I've always been really interested in is,
and I found that the WhisperX, I feel like the WhisperX is at the point where I feel satisfied with that the quality is good enough. I've been waiting for years and years and years to be able to basically like have the AI be good enough. And I think I think there still needs to be things that are corrected. But I feel like it's at a critical threshold for it's maybe 90 to 95% correct. And the fact that I am able to put in my website, these speaker codes that people can spot check it. So they can basically jump to these different moments and then hear what's being said.
Was there a specific experience that you had, like a turning point?
And yeah, just to be able to have like both that down to like the millisecond, and it gets pretty precise. You can hear like as it starts.
I mean, I go back to the storytelling part of it.
So it's, I think it's at the point where it's good enough for me to essentially after this conversation, I'm going to just upload the rough transcripts that I have so far. And I have it identified here as rough transcript, and I'll probably, give a little disclaimer that these are not finalized. And I'll need to go through and basically replace the speakers with actual speaker names. So that's another thing where with the diarization with WhisperX, you have to tell how many speakers there are. So if in this conversation, there's 3 speakers. But if there's a conversation where there's Q&A at the end, then you have to also identify those speakers as well. And so I'm still in the process, like right now, you can see that I can start to go through and start spot checking different things. And if there's an error, to have to go back and correct it and like re-upload it. So I've tried to create a pipeline so that I'll have to assume that there's going to be manual intervention, and then assume I'm going to go back and have to correct things and then put it back into the website. Now, I guess one of the things that I wanted to bring up in terms of where I'd like to see this going, but like the technology isn't quite there yet. What I mean by that is I would like to be able to eventually, potentially, like for each one of these answers, create that as a singular entity that could be put into relationships to other conversations. That's essentially my episode 1000, where here, I'll bring it up. Voices of VR 1000. So my episode 1000 is essentially, it's a 3-hour conversation where I'll have down at the bottom here, like it's these different sections, and I'm drawing from quotes from specific moments from people speaking about the ultimate potential of VR. And I think it's 119 different quotes or 120 different quotes from different people. And it took a long time to put together, but it's essentially what I would love to see in the future is to be able to kind of dynamically create these different types of, themed conversations, or at least much more quickly go in and start to come up with, like, here's the topic that people like medical XR, or let's look at all the Afrofuturism, immersive storytelling experiences and different insights, and then start to take some of these individual clips and start to kind of stream them together to have a little bit more of an ad hoc, either podcast episode, or if you're in an immersive experience, maybe start to have an ability to be able to discover different moments of connection between these different conversations. So the problem right now is that WordPress only allows you to add taxonomy terms or tags at the post level, meaning that I can only categorize this entire conversation with a taxonomy term. But in order to add a taxonomy term or relational dynamic to this individual chunk, I would have to use something like GraphQL to be able to put this at a high level post. And then from that high level post, kind of dynamically stream it together, because at the moment, WordPress only allows you to add tags and taxonomies to a post level. You can't have an advanced custom field that allows you to add a taxonomy term to another term or to another custom field. There might be a module way of doing that. So right now, I'm basically run into a roadblock as to like where this could go in the future. Is I don't think it's as useful to have entire transcripts. What you really want is the ability to maybe pull out one single clip and then put it into relationship to another clip and maybe have an immersive experience where you're having these clips. Right now, you could do the entire podcast episode, and that's probably, already going to be potentially interesting to start to put into relationship these overall conversations that have these tags in an immersive experience. But I think I'd really want to have like at the granular level to really live into what I think the potential is, where you go into an immersive experience and start to see these relationships between these moments, and you'd be able to kind of dial in and maybe even have people tag them and have other people start to curate their favorite quotes or moments from the podcast, and start to create a way that when you're in the immersive experience, maybe you start to tie these moments together. But like I said, right now, all of this entire transcript is put into one single advanced custom field. It's just a giant text area. Where I have this HTML where I'm kind of processing and adding this JavaScript to the timecode, and having the speaker changes so that you can at least have it more of a human readable transcript that you're able to go through. So that's basically what I wanted to show. I'm at this like dead end, or at this like point where I don't know what the future, like with GraphQL, you can start to do things from like the REST API and start to query things. And like I said, if there's a way to add, like, so there's an infinite field for advanced custom fields, meaning that you could add, like each of these speaker changes could be their own field, and then you could have a bunch of these fields together. But in the absence of being able to add any sort of metadata to these individual fields through like a taxonomy term onto the field level, then I'm not able to sort of draw connections to these more granular moments of these conversations. And, you know, there would be the potential to put them at the post level where you have a hidden post type, and then you're able to add each of these sections as a post. But then that ends up being like, for every time you want to see the transcript, you basically have to query it and put it all together. So in order to like really live into the potential, I have to either come up with a way to having a taxonomy term at these individual fields, or start to kind of break the WordPress in a way that wasn't necessarily the way it's designed, put each of these different conversations at the post level, and then string it together so you can add taxonomy terms from there. So anyway, that's probably a good place to stop. I'd love to hear any other thoughts or feedback or reflections on what I've gone through so far. Happy to also answer any questions, and love to hear any potential ideas as I start to move forward for where this could go in the future.
Thank you very much for that. There will be plenty of questions, comments, and suggestions, I'm sure. This is similar to what we've been looking at in a much smaller corpus. I looked up how many episodes we have. It's only 233. To me, it feels like a lot. But anyway, we use Sonics.ai for the transcription, and it does a pretty good job of recognizing the different speakers, diarization, you called it. However, you have to type in the names every time. You know, in a community like this, it's the same people. I have a request to the company, gives us an option to import the speaker set to the next one. Huge issue. So I'm glad you brought that up. Very interesting to see your WordPress integration. And even though I don't see any digital hands, I know there will be lots of comments and questions. So I'll pipe down for a minute. Yeah, Leon.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much. It was really impressive, actually. I was really excited, actually, when I saw that you could also immediately play at a certain offset in the audio player. I really liked it. I think Google will also, I can imagine a way where you sort of end up at a certain place in the page and then immediately click it, and you don't have to listen to the whole podcast, which I think is great because podcasts can be very long. I guess my question is, I have two questions. Have you thought of doing something with fragments to generate fragments with you know, the anchor tag, hash, some section, etc. And the second is, I'm curious about, you know, do you have any thoughts on RSS feeds where you can sort of perhaps have immersive RSS feeds? So, because you were talking about, you know, jumping into a certain clip in an immersive way. I immediately started to think of like, wow, that would be sort of the next generation RSS feed, sort of. But these are my two questions.
So right now, as I'm going through and adding both taxonomy terms, there's the high level taxonomy term and then the sub taxonomy terms, or they're in WordPress, they're called categories and tags. But both the categories and tags, let me just share my screen again real quick. So if I go to one of these things, like say immersive storytelling, because that's the one that I have covered the most. Entertainment, wait, oops, hold on. It's still, so entertainment will actually have all of these different things. So that's a good point there. So everything that's tagged on any of these subcategories will show up in the high level entertainment. So if you're just interested in all the entertainment, there's 162 episodes of entertainment, and that's all the stuff that I've tagged so far. I've tagged probably around 200 and so. So the most of my coverage has been biased towards immersive storytelling and entertainment. But on the whole, there's a broad range of different topics. But if I go to say immersive storytelling, and I'm going to just make sure I can see. So if you go to the end of this and you add the word feed, it automatically has an RSS feed for each of these categories. And the RSS feed would be for the entirety of the podcast. When you do like YouTube and videos, you can like seek to a very specific moment in a podcast. And for this, you would have to do something like FFmpeg to be able to actually create discrete audio files. I think that's probably the easiest thing to do, because I don't know if it's easy to seek to specific. I mean, I have the WordPress integrations here that has JavaScript that can seek to specific moments. So it's certainly possible within WebXR. If I can do it on the website, you can also do it with, if you have a timecode information, seek to that specific moment. But I don't know if there's an ability to stop it playing. It would continue to play. So when I've looked at this before, I used FFmpeg to be able to basically, create the input and output and create these audio chunks. So you could basically go through and say, every time there's a speaker change, create that as a discrete file. And then from that discrete file, you could then play that. And maybe you could do an additional seeking, but you would be able to stop it. So being able to start and stop, I've looked at this before in terms of back in like the early 2000 and I was working on a project called the Echo Chamber Project, where I was using a whole list of a corpus of like 80 interviews to do this kind of dynamic editing type of stuff in the website. But I was using Smile as a format to be able to have the start and stop. But I don't know if that's necessarily something that folks have used as much anymore. I do think that part of the use case that I see would be that you go in and maybe see some clips that in an immersive experience, and maybe you see a cluster of relational dynamics, and maybe you click a button that says add this to an RSS feed, and you could sort of dynamically create a playlist or a category that would then allow you to subscribe and then go offline and listen to that. But the categories already are enabling me to do that. And you can also do tags. So I don't know, this is sort of just brainstorming, like if this WordPress was a community site where people had user accounts and they could add their own tags, then maybe they could start to add their own taxonomy or add their own way of organizing it. And then from those terms, discover stuff and create a playlist. I think this is the use case of what is the user story that's going to be driving like the future development of whatever this is. And I think one of it is discovery of these podcasts to listen to. And the other one could be searching the transcripts. So this is another question that I have, which is with these being an advanced custom field, if you wanted to search it, is it better for search functionality to have it into one field? And does that automatically have it connected to the post type? And then the other thing is that because there's a speaker being changed and identifying with advanced custom fields, I can also add like information about like, this is the speaker, and then add potentially on top of that, other metadata about that speaker around who do they work for? What are they doing? How do they label? What's their background, training, and like computer science architecture? And so you can also have this other layer of like, say, go through the Voices of VR archive. Let me hear from everyone who's trained as an architect, but is currently working in immersive storytelling. Show me all those interview clips from that. So starting to sort of dial in with, but that's more of a search functionality that's in there as well. So the fragments, in terms of your first question, this is something that like right now I'm just generating HTML. So anything that could add onto HTML, I could add. The challenge, I think, is like the data entry to add the metadata and to the tagging would want to have maybe some sort of interface to be able to do that. Or if I'm letting the community do that, or if I'm relying upon AI in some fashion, like it's already a lot for me to go through and add taxonomy terms to all the episodes. It's going to take me another week or two to go through even the 1,000 episodes to add the terms of the taxonomy. And the process of adding terms is always like, is this a term? Is this a novel thing? Do I add a new term? Should I add this as a tag and then have a process for having a Folksonomy tag graduate to like a higher level category? So shifting between the hierarchy of the categories and making it so it's simple enough that people can navigate it, but there's always incompleteness because of Gödel incompleteness. And so there's always going to be stuff that doesn't fit into that. So then do you close that gap with a tag? And then, so there's this, both the tags and the categories in WordPress allow you to have an RSS feed. So you're not losing any functionality, whether or not you give it a tag or category. It's just mainly, once I go through the entire archive, what is the sort of the vocabulary of the taxonomy will be more firm at that point. But it's a process where it's like adding adding categories to all this information. So in terms of fragments, when you start to go at the granular level, that's a whole other process of like, is that taxonomy vocabulary that I've created, is that going to be robust enough to then go at that granular level to add additional fragments or additional way to hook in there? Because it's HTML, you can add all sorts of different things in there, but it's mostly like, what is the WebXR use case for what this is going to be? And does that make sense? And what is the search use case? That for me is the two main things that I'm looking at as I'm moving forward. And that's part of the reason why I'm coming here, just to say here, what do you think would be generally useful to sort of add into the mix? And what are the other tools that I don't know about to start to make it easier? And how do I sort of architect this in a way that works for the website, but also is robust enough to be used into the future of WebXR?
Thank you. It's very tricky. It's a sensitive thing to have these tags, these categories, and then perhaps anchor tags. They're all like moving parts, and they're supposed to be sort of really tight connected to keep it manageable, because otherwise it's sort of, it's coupled but also decoupled, so it's sort of loose coupled, which makes it very sensitive and tricky to manage. So thanks for explaining all this.
Fabian, I see your hand up, and I don't know if anybody else has clicked through on what you posted in the side here. It was worth saying if you haven't already. Please, Fabian, please go on.
Thank you. So there was a little experimentation of bringing the RSS feed to WebXR, and it's one of the first conclusions is like, why? Like, what's the point? It's a different format, it has to be explored differently. Now, though, with the transcript, we can navigate differently, so it does beg a new question and to experiment, especially some of the experiments we've run through that group. It would definitely be something interesting. Now, a couple of points. I personally usually use transcript to search after listening to a podcast. Like I'm on the go. I'm listening indeed to something while doing something not intellectually demanding. That's usually my favorite moment for podcast, either commuting or, as you say, doing the dishes or sorting things. And mentally, I'm like disconnected to the task, but I can focus on what's being said. So I feel efficient, let's say. And usually, if it's a good podcast, like most of Ken's podcasts, then I want to share it after. But I don't want to share the whole thing. I want to share what was meaningful for me. And to be honest, even if it's just a sentence, if I have to transcribe it myself, because I want to quote it, what somebody else said, I want it like 100%. And if I have to type it, like, if it's not like really brilliant, I'm not going to bother, which is really a shame. And quite often I find myself, like, I think the Santa Fe Institute podcast, the SFI podcast, does it. Like they have the podcast itself and then the transcript, and usually that's what I do after. I copy paste what I find it, which just also mean I don't have to remember even the timestamp. Instead of listening to the podcast and taking a photo in the phone, like I don't care, because 1 or 2 words are going to be enough to find it back in the transcript. Copy paste, share it. So in terms of bring the information to more people, I really think that helps a lot. And I share it, because I think it's meaningful, but then also because people might have a completely different opinion. So then they can challenge it or share it back. So that's one simple way, let's say. It doesn't have to be about query and all this, but so that's my for now, let's say the very basic way. What this problematic reminds me is some of the problem or challenges I have at work. A colleague recently asked about not using transcription, but using face recognition or tagging of photos, like a very large library of photos, and they have the ability, I don't know if that's a word, but the browsability at scale is very challenging. And we get the same thing, like, do we want tags? Do we want people's face? Do we want like something where you select a part of the photo, like content-based, basically image retrieval? And the challenge is not necessarily the how to do it, but rather like what kind of query do they want? Like one of my colleagues is specialized in machine learning, so he's asking my other colleague, like, yeah, don't tell me the solution, the implementation. I'll fix it. I'll make it work for you. But what queries, like what is meaningful for you, let's say in a search? And I will basically start this a bit more this way, meaning even if you're not sure it's going to be implementable, and especially with the reach you have, the vast community you have of people who are technically quite able, I would start with this more like, what are the queries you individually want, what the community want, and even if it might be impossible, doesn't matter. Like most people are going to take it as a challenge. So I would flip it like this. And I would also not care about completeness. I know it's a bit vulgar to say this, but I think it's too hard, and I don't think it's feasible. So pragmatic usefulness over completeness, especially because if we talk about organizing information like Mereology, how many tags describe one concept, I think it depends on the goal and the expertise. So there is not an answer to this, and that answer is going to evolve over time. So I think, yeah, it's a bit vulgar, but yeah, just make it pragmatic, useful today, and then it's going to evolve, it's going to change, and some of it is going to go to the trash, but that's okay, because the learning process, while doing it, basically it's going to be both an exciting adventure, and in my opinion, more accurate than postponing for the perfect schema that's, I don't believe in.
Yeah, with Gödel and the incompleteness theorems, either you're going to be consistent or complete, but you can't be both. So I've sort of opted for a bit of a pair-consistent clustering and trying to strive for that completeness, because there is a wide breadth of what people say the ultimate potential of VR is, but there is this constant tension between, as you're adding the tags, like, you know, you're expanding the tags or using existing tags, or it's like sort of like close, or, you know, it's like, so I had like world building as one of the topics, but there was a lot of environmental storytelling, and environmental storytelling is different than world building. So when are you using it in the context of telling a story, and when are you doing it in the context of building a world to imagine some sort of speculative future? And those are different types of like contextual domains, and knowing what the sort of high level taxonomy terms versus the sub terms. And so how does that term, so a cluster of sub, but at the sub context terms and the taxonomy tags, you can have that granularity of completeness, but you start to have this sort of pair consistency or incompleteness or kind of paradoxical combinations of things. So this is something that I've done so many interviews in the industry that I've sort of settled upon this taxonomy. Like I said, this talk that I gave at South by Southwest, that's online, the ultimate potential of VR, promises and perils, is basically my elaboration of that, as well as my episode 1000 to start to dig into that. And in terms of like the seeking into specific moments or like the transcripts, so like the way that I have it is that you could go through and maybe search for the moment that you heard in a podcast, and then click and then try to seek to at least to the beginning of that, and then listen to it and then kind of verify what the transcript is, because it's always like, you know, it's a rough transcript. And so, you know, the amount of manual labor it's going to take to correct these transcripts is going to be quite, you know, involved over time. You know, what is it going to take to go from the 90% or 95% complete of the rough transcript into like 100% like human verified you know, transcription is like quite a lot of manual labor. But at least the way that I have it now, there might be some way to crowdsource some of that, or at least, you know, I don't know. That's kind of an open question. Is it good enough just to do with the rough transcript and kind of let people seek and actually listen for themselves and kind of do that? You know, if there's something wrong, you can always refer back to it. It's worth mentioning that WhisperX has the capability of doing per word transcripts, But the SRT files for that are basically really untenable because it's basically like it repeats, like let's say there's 10 words in an SRT line. Usually in an SRT file would be one line, but for the SRT files that are produced for that, it creates 10 different lines, and for each word it has some syntax to highlight it, which means if there's a wrong word in there and you have to correct it, you basically have to correct it like 10 different times rather than just correcting it one time. So although the per word feature is really, I know like Otter AI has that, but to basically do that on the back end with these open source tools right now, it's untenable to edit it. If it's a perfect transcript, that's great. You know, you could do per word transcripts to be able to go specifically seek to that word. But I've basically decided that this needs to be architected to assume that it's wrong and you need to correct it. And if it's going to be way more work to correct it with this per word transcript, then the per word transcript feature is not mature enough to deploy because it's going to take way too much manual work to be able to do. But I'm hoping that the tools are there to be able to do that. And so maybe it'll get easier to be able to like click on a single word and seek. So, you know, WhisperX will be able to produce like a time code for every single word that's being spoken. But at this point, that's a matter of like, how do you process that? And maybe there's a way to like process that metadata and make it so it's, you know, not in a, well, anyway, it's basically like it might be a software problem to be able to solve that, because right now the raw data are there, but it's, you know, basically too much.
I see we have Brendel, Peter, and Mark, but after they talk, I put a little note here in the comments. It would be nice to talk about what you want your users to do with this, you know, what the point of the archive is before we dig into the how it can be done, because with such rich material that, you know, it really comes down to that aspect as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that I'm just sort of like, people have asked for transcripts for a long time, but now that I've started to see that the AI is mature enough for me to do the rough transcript, then it's a question of what do they want and what do I, and I think the big features are going to be either searching archive, and being able to potentially have some sort of WebXR experience of them. And what that is, that's basically no one's done that before. So it's like, what's possible here. So what I've realized is that the diarization actually does a good job of chunking it. So speaker changes are a good way to at least start. Like if we assume that anybody, maybe it's the question and the answer. And so maybe it's like the thing that's before, the thing that's after. But there may be a way of thinking about, now that you have per speaker chunks of text, is there a way to kind of play with that in a XR experience that makes it more interesting in a spatial dynamic, or you're able to sort of tie together at a higher level to go into an immersive experience and start to discover relationships between clusters of information. And you walk out of that with like a series of different podcasts that you go listen to while you're washing dishes or commuting. So it's basically the WebXR is a discovery mechanism to be able to discover interviews that you want to listen to in full, or you're drawing connections between fragments, or you're doing something about some sort of knowledge representation to be able to see this information in a spatial context that makes it much more interesting than just looking at a 2D context, because now all of a sudden, now that it's in a 3D context, you can start to do more interesting things with that, that's not as interesting if you're just looking at like the linearization of that with listening to the podcast. So that's at least my thought, but I definitely need to get more feedback from my users now that I start to deploy it. Okay, what do people want? And then start to kind of tinker around what's even possible with doing the WebXR manifestation of it. So,
and with that, over to Randall.
Hi, Ken. This is really exciting to see as a sort of a resource and a reference. One of the things that it makes me wonder about is you have a lot of stuff about tagging, about the sort of the explicit sort of binary identification of things sort of falling inside or outside of categories, but it doesn't necessarily, that kind of information per se doesn't necessarily lend itself to the ability to kind of locate things spatially. Are there methods or mechanisms that you have, in your back pocket, do you have a sense of like these things might be spatialized in terms of where podcasts actually reside in a 2D sort of surface space or a 3D space, and candidates for sort of being able to kind of identify those spatial positions with greater granularity to be able to kind of push those things through. Like, do you have attributes that you like? You know, there might be tags, but some things might have more aspects of a certain sort of dimension or component if something is more architectural than another thing. Are there ways that you're thinking about that? And to that, I will also add there's this tool NodeXL, which is a free plugin for Microsoft Excel if you're on Windows, that you can use for doing social network analysis over those attributes, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, first, have you got any thoughts about how you would spatialize the sort of the distribution and presentation of all of these podcasts in a way that means that you could navigate it in that way?
Yeah, really, really good question. So as I'm going through and adding these different categories to these different podcasts, that's creating clusters of, things that are related to each other. Like, you already have the high level tags, but then you have sort of the intersections of, say, the intersection between architecture and storytelling is one that I find really interesting, where it's something that is people that are trained in a completely different discipline, but they're exploring ways of doing speculative futures or looking at the spatial design, which is, way different than, say, most folks who are coming from the 2D realm. Like, architects are already thinking spatially. So the way that they're approaching immersive storytelling and thinking about the medium is like a lot more interesting, because they're an interdisciplinary field that is already thinking spatially. So what they do with XR is like their natural medium of communication. So that's just one example of how these intersections happen. And so, there's a big interdisciplinary push in my coverage of XR, how, like, I always ask people, what is your background? Give me a bit more context as your background and your journey into VR. And so what I have now actually is a lot of the conversations is the speaker and what their training is. Are they trained in computer science? Is it dance? Is it cinema? So you start to have this other layer of like the metadata of the speaker and what their background is, but also, what is, who do they work for? They work for Meta, or they are a nonprofit. So there's other things of like the sort of second order relational dynamics of these, like, show me all the different nodes of people I've talked to Meta or Magic Leap or HTC or, people talking about Apple. So there's like the platform players. So that's one thing. So the relational dynamics between the speaker and how they're related, and all the metadata and tagging to the speaker, and how what they're saying is actually going to be specific insight, where you could start to have, plus all the people who have a dance background that are doing immersive storytelling. That's interesting, choreography. So then the other thing is, if you think about, I say as a provocation oftentimes, what would it mean to create a memory palace of all space and time? Like, that's a provocation of like, what would be the immersive way of approaching that at an abstract level. And so just from the evolution and history of XR is a technology that was like, Tom Furness, Mort Heilig, and then Tom Furness were working on things, and, and then it led to the sort of Damocles, which is like the first publicly known thing. But then, Tom Furness was also working at a secret level in the Air Force on augmented and virtual reality before even, at the same time, even before 1966, before Ivan Sutherland's. So you have this history, and then you have the history of VR at the very beginnings, and then you have in the mid 80s and 90s, and then you have the modern resurgence of VR that the Oculus Rift DK1 had a Kickstarter in August of 2012, and then it was released in March of 2013. So that's sort of the beginning of like the start of consumer VR. And then you have like the 10-year anniversary that happened. And so what are the milestones of that? And so if you think about it spatially, you could say, well, okay, Beat Saber was a big thing. Or, whenever the announcement of HTC at Mobile World Congress of the HTC Vive, it was like a shocking, like, oh my God, there's a brand new VR headset at GDC 2015, So there's these moments of the history of VR that you could start to represent spatially. And then I've done these interviews. So like, at what point So the challenge of doing this oral history at this scale is that I've recorded 2,000 interviews, but I've only published like 1,200, which means that I've recorded a bunch of stuff that if I publish it now, the published date is not as interesting as the record date. So there's the record date of this stuff where I'm trying to capture the history as it's unfolding. And so what is the other relational dynamics of that? So one thing that I thought, well, what are the mile markers that you could take? Well, there's information of like, say, scraping through all the data from the major releases of VR experiences, from Oculus Home into like MetaQuest Store, into Steam, into PSVR. Like, what are the dates of when the things were coming out? And then you have the other dates of like, what was Road to VR covering? What was Upload VR covering? And so you have this kind of spatialization of a timeline of like, here is the news. And then you have this other dimension of like, here are the conversations that I've had with these people that are related to these sort of mile markers. Like the Apple Vision Pro was a big turning point. You know, that's like, it's almost like a before Apple Vision Pro and post Apple Vision Pro. Like a bunch of the interviews I did at Augmented World Expo was before it was announced. No one knew what it was. And then now that it's announced, now everybody can refer to it as a thing that's happened, but it sort of changed the conversation. And so having those other contextual things in a spatialized context to say, this conversation actually happened before this happened and after that happened, to kind of help you understand the historical development of these things. Like I have an interview with some of the, like NextVR. NextVR was the 360 video company that was bought by Apple. So I have an interview that's unpublished with them, right? And so a lot of the technology that NextVR did is now started being developed into the future of 180 videos with Apple. But I have a conversation with them before they were acquired that I just haven't had time to publish yet. So there's this kind of historical information that if you look at like, well, this is actually a big development that happened with Apple Vision Pro and where they're going to take the future of 180 video. But there's this historical thing that I have that's captured that may be leading into it that maybe wasn't like relevant enough because, you know, NextVR was basically went silent, and they also were acquired. So there's things like that, looking at how to kind of spatially represent these moments in time. And again, it's like connected to that. And the other thing, if I didn't mention it clearly enough, is that at the high level of these different conversations, how to sort of explore the node graph of like clusters of things and related to like basically a social graph that has these clusters of podcasts and topics and interviews that you could start to then potentially explore from that perspective at the high level of this podcast. So those are some of the different things that I think about spatialization, but this provocation of what would a memory palace of all space and time, or at least the memory palace of the history of VR, what would it look like to have an immersive experience to give you this broader context that you understand the historical development, and then that gives you a spatial reference point as you're listening to things to know what was happening in the overall industry as it continues to evolve.
Peter.
Okay, have you taken a look at automatic sentiment analysis? It'd be really interesting to be able to do a query like criticisms of the Lawnmower Man anywhere within the archive. And in terms of visualizations, I'd be very interested in seeing a plotting of speakers, topics versus sentiment in a three-dimensional space, so that we could see the switch off between speakers, whether on a given topic, one was expressing positive and negative sentence bouncing up and down to suggest that there might have been a hot debate going at that point in time, whether you'd be able to discern that visually from looking at the data spread. Also, you might want to look at description logics in terms of a formalism for developing advanced queries of the system.
Yeah, so I have not looked at sentiment analysis right now. I'm just trying to get the transcripts available and potentially the metadata in a way that would be helpful to be able to do stuff like that. Although the caveat there is that, you know, there's been a lot of large language model type of development where there's like a whole archive of like, say, data that has been sucked into AI to be able to produce different things like large language models. And so one of the things that I'm hesitant about is that I don't know, like I sort of think about the content that I do as like a shared consent model where I own part of the copyright and the other person kind of owns part of their copyright. It's the formalization that hasn't been formalized in any explicit way. It's just more of an informal way that I think about it. So when I think about like, if I do an interview with somebody and I post it on my podcast, does that mean that they have consented for me to do all this other stuff about that? And to what degree do they consent to it? It's a bit of the Wild West and ability to move forward, but there are specific ethical considerations to think about, for me at least, as I start to move forward with this. And how do I be in right relationship to all the people I've talked to, and are they okay with this or that happens with this data? For sentiment analysis, I think, for me, the first thing that comes up is things like privacy, is things where, there's concerns around different things and critiques around big companies, around surveillance capitalism, and how to actually address some of this. So more along the lines of so some of that will be revealed of like, here's all the topics I've done about privacy, or I have a tag called analysis. So anytime anybody writes a book about the topic, it's like analysis. So trying to come up with the higher level reflections of these different topics. I have a tag of research when I talk to different researchers about stuff. But in terms of just people sharing like an offhanded comment, like about the dystopic nature of Ready Player One as an example, or, there's less things about Lawn Mower Man. It's more about like Ready Player One and Snow Crash, or, the influence. And I think the output would be more of like, I think generally people that I talk to are generally either like positive or negative. I think probably an interesting thing when I ask people, what is the ultimate potential of VR? Most people go into the exalted potentials, but there are some people who like start to say, well, here's all things that could go wrong when they think about the ultimate potential. They don't actually think about the ultimate potential. They think about the ultimate dystopia, or ultimate like things for where this could go horribly wrong. And so sometimes when I ask people the ultimate potential, they give me like a negative sentiment rather than a positive sentiment. But I do think that there is this sort of tension of the promises and perils of XR, where any sophisticated conversation that I have, it sort of organically emerges of like, here's the things that are great, here are the things that are bad. So I've tagged a lot of those in terms of ethics of specific conversations where we talk about some of those ethical and moral dilemmas of XR, where it's more of like the entirety of the conversation is more of a critique. So right now, I'd say, when I think about my archive, most of that type of critique comes up when I come across, a topic, say someone who's going to be critically thinking about privacy in XR, or, anthropologists who are critiquing Meta around the responsible innovation practices that they have. So that's what was the other thing you asked? Something about, what was the other part of your question? Sorry.
I'd mentioned description logics.
I'm not familiar with that. What do you mean?
Okay, it's a database derived technology for categorizing how descriptors can be combined in order to form queries, and also being able to do reasoning at higher categorical levels. So you wouldn't necessarily be tagged at the higher category, but you'd know that the tag is attached to a subcategory of a category, and you could build a query in terms of the higher level categories, and also classify something accordingly based upon the individual features.
I have not looked at that because I'm just learning about what that is right now in this moment. So
Yeah, I put a link in the chat to the description logics homepage.
Okay, so what I would say is that I have started to add categories and tags to higher level posts. Do you know if something like that has already been integrated to do that type of querying in, say, WordPress, or using the tags and taxonomy, the tags and categories features within WordPress? Do you know if there's like a plugin that does that?
Oh, I have no idea what's happening in the WordPress ecosystem. I basically roll my own whenever I'm building something.
Okay.
See you later, Brandel.
What's that? Oh,
No, but Brandel had to leave. I just said,
okay.
see you later. Sorry, I didn't mean to speak. The mute wasn't on and I was going to be typing. Are we ready for Mark Anderson's question?
Yep.
So it's a kind of multifaceted thing, but it's trying to loop back to some of the issues you were addressing, because just at the moment, in fact, the day job from which my meeting was cancelled, so I'd be here, is actually all about sort of metadata and appropriate collection. A couple of things struck me when you're speaking. I was lovely to hear about RSS. Great. Don't overlook there's a JSON feed as well, because JSON's hotter and cooler and newer, and there's a WordPress plugin for that, if that helps. I hear your pain about this thing about sort of bookmark of trying to tag, and the fact that the tags seem malleable over time. And one thing that suggests to me, and I know from having to do similar exercises on quite large sort of sets of work in the past, that something I couldn't do at the time, but I think is easier now, is to just disconnect the tags. So that instead of trying to tag it into the thing you're looking at, be it WordPress, or thinking, how am I going to shim this into this paragraph, is to view it another way around. So, okay, I've got all these tags, which I will start with the premise that I'm going to get wrong at outset. I'll get them close enough, but I'll also get them wrong. Because so if I go and get my set of tags, then I can review those. I can even use AI in a useful, positive way, in terms of using it as a counter check to what I'm doing. Does it see different facets to it? Does it see others? Like as not, your expertise in this area is way better than somebody's LLM, because you're just more absorbed in it, and so you won't make the mistakes a large language model will in making pointless associations, because it just sees something that basically is out of scope. But I do think it can be really useful in terms of helping you resolve the tagging issue, because I think the evidence is there that most of us individually are really, really poor at tagging. And I think once one gets comfortable with that, it's easier to do it. In other words, expect to make a mistake, because then it's easy to just get on with it. So I'm going to come back, I'm going to have to do a second pass. And if you accept that, then you want to think about, okay, so how do I connect my sort of set of tags to this thing, to this transcript I've got. And it made me think of, there's a term rattling around at the moment of standoff metadata, which sort of came out of, I think, Digital Humanities thing. But it's just metadata another way in which it's saying, well, I'm going to need to overlay lots of metadata onto this thing, but I don't want to couple it in really closely. So you'll be taking an offset. So you could be taking a word offset, you could be taking a time offset. So you say at position X for this much, and then you can just link it to anything you want. And because it's not necessarily actually sort of compiled, as it were, down into something like the HTML, you haven't got a problem about overrunning tags. And this means you can also begin to address the richness of some of the questions you've mentioned, because most of our systems are actually quite sort of hard-edged when it comes to tagging. But when you listen to the sort of questions people want to ask, they're a lot more fluid than that, which requires a much more fluid, a multifaceted set of metadata. So finding a way to sort of have a looser coupling, I think, helps one as a sort of content owner, small o, in terms of the expert in the middle of this, trying to put useful and tractable search and indexing information on it. You mentioned timelines. Well, if keywords are horrid, timelines are worse, because they're always lumpy. And most timeline tools are rubbish because the authors never looked at real data. So they break, immediately put real data in, because they can't cope with the fact that really all the times want to stack on top of one another. So if you do go down that thing, just don't expect most of the things to work well. And the best thing I found, which is a similar timeline, sadly, they lost their funding and it's stuck at pre-HTML5. Still better than a lot of things. Sorry, that was a bit round the houses, but I just hope that might be helpful in terms of how you connect up your metadata.
You have some comments on the tagging, but I wanted to follow up first on the question. You said that like a loosely coupled way of adding that. Did that have a name for that?
No, I think it's, well, in my mind, it's more an attitude of mind in the sense of I think we all have the temptation. So if you have your main interface with your archive, as it were, is say your WordPress, So you start thinking this is a WordPress thing to do this, or do you know, you try working with the thing immediately in front of it. And I would suggest just stepping back a bit. Think of what the tagging you're trying to do without immediately thinking, where do I insert it? And I think that just gives you a freedom to have some slightly different approaches to it. I mean, sometimes it will be the case that, you know, you can't do this in that bit of software, or you can't do it on this OS. We all hit those hard edges, but I don't think, I'm not aware of it as a term. I see it as a way of buying some sort of buffer against the fact that we're not, or very few of us are good at keywording, and even when we're in a sense one of the master experts in the subjects, it's really hard to do, because you start, and what you notice is as you go through the corpus, your understanding of a term changes. Drifts.
Well, at this point, I'm like maybe a little over 200 episodes of the 1200 that I tried to do this earlier, and then now that I've gotten to the point where I did my episode 1000, where it's like, here is the ultimate potential, and here's all the different contextual domains that are included in there. And then the ethics work that I've done is another way of manifesting that same contextual domains. And then I did my talk at South by Southwest, which was like, here is my take of a 50-minute talk where I'm trying to give you a spectrum of all the different applications of XR. And then from that, it's sort of an elaboration of these different contexts. So the big differentiating factor for me is going to be, as I go through and I add all these different categories, like the taxonomy has a hierarchy, and it's going to be revealed to the user in a menu. So I want to have it robust, but I don't want to be overwhelming. So there's like a million categories. And so there may be things that are, once I go through the corpus, maybe there's only one or two like posts that are tagged a specific thing on a category. Well, maybe that's a good opportunity to translate that into, rather than a category, put it as a tag and reveal it in a tag cloud. The difference between categories and tags is that categories have hierarchy, whereas tags are just kind of absent of that hierarchical context. I don't think WordPress has ability to put parent tags. So there is this ability to have like a subcategory, and then like just say all the entertainment experiences, regardless of what the entertainment is. And then if you want to dial in, you can get more specific. And so I think the use case is going to be, maybe the most useful is going to be the subcategory, but maybe people are just generally interested in all entertainment interviews that I do, or all medical interviews, or all ideas that I talk about. I've often found like, I want to send somebody an interviews with all of the people I've talked to who are neuroscientists, or all the people I've talked to who are philosophers. And I have to go through and like search individual posts and like send them a bunch of links. Now there will be just a single URL that, rather than seeing all these links, like go to this URL, you'll hear all the philosophical discussions I've had about XR. And also there's a podcast feed. You can just subscribe to it and listen to them all. So, and the tags also have the ability to have a podcast feed. So a good example is, say, Apple. Like Apple doesn't fit in the hierarchy, but anybody who wants to know about Apple or Meta or these platform players. So there may be other things that don't fit into that category, but still want to be like, okay, I want to hear all the different discussions around this very, very specific technology of hand tracking or whatnot. Maybe that's a tag, and maybe it's a category. I don't know. I'm still, once I get through, I'll see like if there's only a small number of things that are tagged as a category, I'll demote it down to a tag. And if I see there's like enough of a tag that has things to warrant be put into the hierarchy in the menu, then I'll promote. So it's going to be kind of a back and forth between those two, but it's mostly the limiting factor is what's overwhelming, what's useful to the users, and what are these tag clouds that I'm going to be using.
Yeah, one thing that did occur to me in terms of sort of decoupling things is that, I mean, if you're working with transcript stuff, then you'll have a transcript which you're basically importing into WordPress and then working with it through that. You can allow yourself to say, well, if I was to just work directly to the to the source that I'm putting into it, does that give me more freedom to just think about the way I interact things? It's working towards the same end, but it's just a method. It's just partly avoiding this thing that I think to which we're all terribly prone, that you pick up the tool in front of you and you use it on everything, or the reverse. The tool that you're using uses itself on you in ways that are cruel and unusual, and don't get you where you want to go.
Yeah, one quick note I want to make is that right now I have one giant text area for advanced custom fields. Eventually it'd be nice to have like the speaker as a separate field and then the text that they say, so that you'd be able to have more of a queryable of like, say, give me, like I've interviewed folks like Philip Rosedale, the founder of Second Life, or Tony Parisi, like consistently over the last 9 years. And so like, show me all the different things of how, when Tony Parisi talks about the ultimate potential, how has his answer changed over time? So that could be another thing. But the architecture of that, from the speaker field and then the text field, and then maybe other metadata field that's tagged, that metadata field that's tagging it doesn't exist right now, at least from the way that WordPress is. Maybe you could just add words in there and then use that functionally on the back end on the code to be able to add that feature of adding taxonomy terms. And maybe it's just a coding, like rather than adding taxonomy terms to post, maybe there's a module that someone can create that allows you to add a taxonomy term to a field that allows you that additional layer of tagging. So these are the types of things I'm kind of running into the architectural limits, but right now I'm just using a giant text field. But in the future, this could be kind of moved into more granular ways, depending on whatever the use case of that is. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to come here to the future of text, because this is kind of like the types of questions of like, what's generally useful? What do people want to do to be able to query this, to be able to think about, as we have these features like WhisperX that can do diarization and do these transcripts, then you have all these new possibilities for what can happen to that data. Because there's a lot of rich media in both podcasts and video that I'm not the only one that's like trying to solve this problem. And once there's text there, then what kind of stuff does that open up?
Thanks. Right.
Yeah, so taxonomies and all of that stuff, I do agree very, very much with some of the earlier comments that, you can basically go on forever. It's like, rearranging your stamp album, something that I have done myself. It is clearly useful to a certain extent, but the deeper you get. So Mark Anderson, he took all the papers from the Hypertext conference that have been cited by somebody and organized them really nicely, something you cannot get straight from ACM. And one of the key findings there was that keywords are nonsense, and also nonce. Nonce in this sense, meaning they are specific for that paper, they don't really occur elsewhere. So it can go on forever. And I can understand your passion for having this interactable in a richer environment where it's not just about some static categories or tags, but it is more how people can go through it. So that leads me to my question. Forgetting all the current tech you've done, all the WordPress and all of that, let's assume that there is a augmented environment, AR, VR, whatever, for this. What do you want the user to do? What I mean by that question is, you've been spending a huge amount of time and effort on a podcast. So is your primary pitch here, is it something along the line of somebody going in and re-listening to either a full episode or part of an episode? Is it for them, when they have listened to an episode, finding something related, or maybe following that person if that person has been featured again, or perhaps a technology or an approach discussed? So, that goes into navigation. Or is it maybe that you want them primarily to interact with the text for learning about an aspect of VR or doing research, whereby the original audio is kind of just a source, which would then be listened to maybe at leisure. But the point is, somebody wants to figure out something, you have an amazing resource, they want to learn. So I asked many questions there, but I'm saying, is it more the experience, which we could call entertainment, but not useless entertainment, of course. It is entertainment for learning, or is it more going in to do research for a specific thing?
Well, the Voices of VR podcast has, like, right now, the longest running VR podcast that's out there. And I've got the most interviews and the largest body of work that's covering the most topics. And so I've had anecdotal evidence when I go to different industry events where people tell me, hey, I listened to your podcast and I got bootstrapped into the industry. And then they stop listening, or people continue to listen. But I basically produce podcasts at a speed that is more than most people can consume. I produce an unreasonable amount of podcasts. It's been like on average, like 2.5 podcasts per week for 9 years. And most people like to listen to maybe one a week or, you know, like I drop them, I'll drop like, you know, a big drop of 25 interviews. And so part of it is like RSS feeds are linear and they actually limit how much I can produce, because I was producing a daily podcast for a long time. And I asked my listeners, hey, is this too much? And everyone uniformly was like, yes, this is too much. So I stopped doing a daily podcast, but I did not stop recording them. So then I have an archive, a backlog of 800 interviews that I haven't published. And in fact, one with Fabian that I haven't published yet, that like, there's just these conversations that I have that are really interesting and that are historical, but to be able to fully comprehensively cover it, I want to produce a lot of content, but it's overwhelming for people given the existing technologies. So for number one, now that I'm adding tagging, that's going to help because people can say, well, I just want to subscribe to anything that you do around entertainment. I don't care about all this other stuff. Or maybe they just want to look at neuroscience. So these other, it allows the users to say, I'm really interested in this topic. Or, but the other use case is, I'm just getting into it. I'm an architect. You know, well, here, go to this URL and listen to all these interviews I've done with architects over the years. Or you want to think about the philosophical ideas. But that's all in the 2D. That now when we start to think about the VR portion, it sort of also addresses some of that same issues of like, there's a whole entire archive of data that if you're just entering into this, here's a body of work that's 1,221 episodes, I think of right now. That's way too much. That's too overwhelming. So how do you discover where to start? And so maybe this is also part of like, as I start to think about expanding my Patreon or thinking about what are the additional things I can use, maybe there's a curriculum that I am guiding people through. Here's some podcasts to listen to. I run into
okay. Hang on a second.
Okay.
That was really key to something we've discussed before. Maybe make a curriculum that you can guide someone through.
Yeah.
That's much more interesting than categories and tags, of course. We've also discussed in this group different levels of something. And we've talked about AI. So, and yes, Fabian, I see your hand. But on the topic of this, let's say you get hit by a truck tomorrow. What do you want your legacy to be if you can have this in a really coherent manner? Is it the teaching aspect? Is it the exciting people to go into VR? Is it for people to understand the deeper issues? Is it, and again, entertainment for that reason? Is it for them to be able to find out what someone said about some kind of immersion, etc.? What you really want people, when this stands, okay, let me not be horrible and say truck tomorrow. Let's say in 200 years, when VR is part of everyone's life and they need to rediscover something, which is part of what our work is. It is for people in the future to go back and think different. What should it be?
Well, I think my episode 1000 is trying to look at the ultimate potential of what the technology is and where it's going. And this talk that I give at South by Southwest and this sort of representation of these domains of human experience. So the ultimate potential of VR is an expression of these different contextual domains of the human experience. And it's exploring these different contextual domains. So if you look at those contextual domains are actually applied to AI as well. They're kind of like, by doing this deep dive into VR as a technology, it's reflecting what does it mean to be human? What are these different contextual domains and how do we want to use technology to either augment or improve or modulate our experience of melding these different contextual domains together? So context is a huge thing where augmented reality is you're in a center of gravity of an existing context and you're pulling in other contextual domains and overlaying on top of that existing context. In VR, you're just doing a complete context switch where you're able to go into these other contextual domains and explore the potentialities of those. I think for me, a big insight about VR has been that it has these metaphysical shifts from object-oriented substance metaphysics into process relational ontologies and metaphysics, meaning that the underlying nature of reality is relationships and potentials rather than objects and stuff. And it's, you know, one thing to say, like people have this dichotomy between the virtual and the real, where they say the virtual is like less than the real. The real is like the real reality. But if real reality is potentials and relationality, then you have these virtual experiences that are just as real and just as meaningful as physical experiences. And so you have folks like Mel Slater who have the casting of VR as the place illusion, the plausibility illusion, the virtual body ownership illusion, or the social presence illusion. It's all cast in illusionary language because it's saying that the substance reality is more real, the physical reality is more real than the virtual experiences. And so David Chalmers in his book of Reality Plus is making the argument that virtually mediated experiences are just as real and just as meaningful as any other experiences, which to me indicates that these virtually mediated experiences are more about the relational dynamics of how they're related to ourselves rather than the physicality of our experience. So because of that, this shift into process relational thinking means that rather than just looking at things as these fixed static objects, there's these relational dynamics. It's the relationality where things get really interesting. So right now, the WebXR experience with a podcast or even a website, there hasn't been a lot of really robust experimentation for what is the more compelling experience for what XR gives you. And for me, my sort of short answer to that is that it allows you to explore the relational dynamics of how one thing is connected to the next, and you're able to draw associations and connections. And so you would go into an immersive experience and then be able to understand the larger context of the relational dynamics, and then have a series of interviews to go listen to have the full context of those conversations that you can go listen to when you're doing something else. But they're like this idea of trying to, like, most of the way that WordPress is architected, it is a very object-oriented way. Like I can't add taxonomy terms to a field, and that's just one example of how WordPress is this sort of like treating everything as one blob. And I need to either have a module or have another way to get more granularity for what can be even more interesting to start to grab these fragments and put them into relationship to each other in an immersive experience. So that's my short answer, is that you go into the immersive experience and you're able to discover these underlying relational dynamics between things. I think it goes back to like the Ted Nelson, having a bidirectional linking to stuff rather than just a singular direction. You're able to sort of connect back and forth and find out what those relational dynamics are. And I think that's what the XR is going to provide. So that's sort of my theory, but no one's built it yet. So I think it's like, once we build it and once we have audiences that are using it, then we'll start to iterate more for what that actually is.
On that whole experience, you brought up linking at the end, as I just typed in here. Just briefly, in the future, how are you thinking that, for instance, me as the editor of the Future of Textbooks, how can I cite your work? Have you thought about how you want to present it in a citable manner? Should that be primarily citing the audio or the video or something different?
Well, so I've tried to, in each of my talks, start to do APA citations for different stuff that I cite. And so that's another question in terms of, when I write a blog post, write-up, that could be cited to me. But then if I'm in a conversation with somebody, I would love to have like auto-generated APA citations that are able to have like all the people that I'm interviewing as co-authors of the citation, because it's a group conversation. And so I think the podcast audio would be like more of a group citation with the name of that podcast episode. And then maybe even down to the if there's a linkable URL that could go specifically to where, like with YouTube, you can link to a URL and go to a very specific point in time of what that conversation is. Right now, there might be a way to add a little fragment in the URL that sort of seeks to that podcast, or connects the URL down to that. But right now, that I don't have the connection between the URL to have the citable moment of a specific moment in the conversation. That might exist, and there may be other ways of adding additional metadata for how these specific moments could be cited. But for me personally, I like APA citations, and maybe there's other things to add, like you have your own sort of bracketed metadata citation format that is added to the bottom of stuff that sort of helps to also create these other relational dynamics. But as I think about, like, there's a 2D interface on the website, but there's also the WebXR experience that could potentially start to draw these different relationships.
Thank you. Fabian.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. To be honest, I'm not sure if you should publish our discussion, because even though it was very interesting and exciting for me, the feeling I had after was like we went literally everywhere. It was a bit of a mess. So I'm not sure how you felt about it. But yeah, maybe we should have another discussion slightly more structured.
But hang on,
but,
Fabian, on that point, maybe later today in this chat, we can talk about how to handle an unstructured discussion, because also in our community, we have many of those. And some of the best stuff we have comes out in those. So it shouldn't be thrown away, but it should be handled in a different way, maybe. Sorry for interrupting you.
As an oral historian and process philosopher, I'm always about taking iterative steps and being immersed into a process of discovery. So I think from that perspective, I think it's valuable. But I mean, I don't know what your existing structure for how these things work, but that's my perspective, as it's all unfolding in a process, and it's you know, it is where it is right now. It's sort of like this process of discovery. So it's up to you whether or not you find it valuable to how you deal with it. That I'll leave that in your court, but that's from my perspective. It's useful for me at least.
Go for it. Now on a more, let's say, technical viewpoint, I do everything in the open. Most things in the open, and as most of you know, I shared some of the weirdest prototype with the hope that some people will get it, but if most people don't, that's also okay. So again, perfectly fine in whatever state that is. Now on the more technical point, I think for the discussion again on tags and whatnot, one of the solution is let's say embedding or TF-IDF, so ways that you basically put on a kind of line of not explicit concept or terms, but like how basically one document, like a podcast or part of a podcast, relate to another, and then people can just type a sentence, and it doesn't have to be like word matching other words. So I think what's been done recently in terms of editing could be potentially useful. So that might be something to explore without going all the way to something explicit. The little thing is it makes it loose and also a bit harder to, let's say, understand or debug. Like if you hit the wrong word, that's it, you don't know. Here, maybe you do, maybe you don't. So I'm not sure how I feel about it, to be honest. I did it try on my own wiki, and it does work sometimes. So most of the time, and often enough, let's say, to be useful. So that's why I think maybe, and one, it's not exclusive. You can have both explicit tags done either by yourself, curated, or from the community, or both, and also embedding. And then let's say if one search fails, then you fall back to, for example, embedding if the explicit tag fails. So that might be a way. And now it's an article that I put in the chat that I shared with the Future of Text group a couple of days ago, but that might be interesting. It's for Blair McIntyre from Georgia Tech, who was part of Mozilla Hub's team a couple of years ago. And basically they use the metaphor of the museum because it's a physical space where you still play with artifacts that might be more interesting in terms of historicity, like how those artifacts evolve over time that you can or not manipulate where you're not in VR. You can just look at them, and basically you have a narrative exploration within this set of artifacts. And I think it's a pretty good analogy. It's a pretty good metaphor. It's not all encompassing, and indeed we just need to go beyond just, let's say, the visit of the physical museum. Even though it's great, it's not what XR proposes. But I think a lot of the things in terms of managing concept, learning, etc., there is definitely a lot to learn from museum. And that article explores some of it and the narrative aspect. So that might be something interesting.
Yeah, there's a sort of like object-oriented like environmental storytelling where there is a lot of historical artifacts where you go around and touch the artifacts and learn about them. That's a trope that I see a lot of in environmental storytelling of using the medium to sort of spatially explore objects from history. I think the challenge that I find when I'm talking about, you know, these conversations and topics, sometimes there's not an explicit translation for what we're talking about into what the spatial representation of that would be. Now that generative AI is getting closer and maybe getting to the point of being able to just speak into like creating a 3D object or a 3D scene, just like we can do prompt engineering with generated images, it may be, you know, within the next year or 6 months or 2 years, 5 years for sure, you would just speak in a certain prompt and then that would give a whole spatial context. So I feel like there's a process of understanding how to translate these topics and ideas. And the reason why I've been so focused on these different contexts is that it does give this design affordance to say, okay, all these different entertainment experiences, here's immersive storytelling, here's gaming, here's theater, you can have these different spatialized metaphorical representations that can start to be like, you can immerse yourself into one of these different situations, and then from there discover some of these different podcasts. So that's a much more kind of embodied presence, environmental presence, where you have a spatial representation of things. But I think there's going to be a whole other kind of like more abstracted experience where you're just exploring the relational dynamics and there's no sort of explicit spatial context that's there. It's more about exploring the relationality of things, but rather than exploring a explicit, spatialization of something. But the lack of clarity of what that spatialization is, I think, leads to some of the challenges of like, it's easier to do that type of thing for like a museum of these artifacts because what the spatial context is, and it's pretty straightforward for what that immersive experience looks like. What the experience of what I'm doing looks like, I think, is more dependent upon what the use case is and what the users want, and also like different ways of kind of flipping into different modalities of exploring this data set. So I think it's, as I'm just getting the website up and running, it's providing the data to be able to potentially do these different types of explorations for what would be the most compelling immersive experience of this data be, whether it's this abstract exploration of doing like this nodal graph relational dynamics exploration, or something that is translated into these very explicit spatial contexts that helps to kind of connect dots between, having a theater stage and having a movie theater, having like different dimensions of the our hospital, or architecture, whatever it ends up being. These different contextual domains have some sort of spatial design to them. So that's an open level of inquiry as I start to move forward. But Fabian, if you have any other resources to the first thing you said in terms of like references or anything about these embeddings or anything, I'd love to hear any other links or anything to follow up on, because yeah.
Alan.
Okay, yes. Hey, Kent, this is fantastic. Really enjoying it. And I'm just going to think out loud for a moment, if you don't mind. It will lead to something. I think to going back to Frode's question earlier, it's a good question. It's an interesting one, because I'm sure it's a question that Frode has for himself as well, right? Like, that's the future of text has the same kind of questions, right? Like, who is this good for, right? What are the problems that they need to solve? And certainly love the angle of before getting to the minutia, what are the big roadblocks? What are the big opportunities? What are the lost gambles? And then from there, that helps me understand a new domain a little bit more easily, right? And so kind of going back, ironically, a lot of has to do with process philosophy, because I'm a fan of that time period and how it plays out today. Whitehead, Russell, etc. In the quick note about tags, Russell would have a lot to say about tags, right? Because tags are just aliases, and everything is essentially an alias for another thing. So he wouldn't be surprised at all that tags aren't really useful, right? But when I think back to those times, or like say Licklider figuring out packets, or the researchers in Hawaii figuring out SMS, we always get the story of what worked, and then that technology got carried on, right? But what we don't ever get to see is, what were the other ideas in that room? What were ideas that didn't pan out at that time because of technological constraints or military, whatever, but were actually like brilliant ideas. And if we had this kind of approach of open-ended cataloging, really trying to do a good job of getting a sense of the issues at the moment, even if we don't have recordings of those rooms, where they're hashing out all the different approaches, could get closer to imagining what the ideas might be, and some of those ideas could definitely, we have a long history of those ideas coming back into play. I mean, the history of AI is a history of, it doesn't work now, and then suddenly some other version of it works, and it carries us forward. So I love the approach of first like documenting and then struggling with what is the best future-proof, most convenient way to ride out all of this documentation, right? I think like Robert Caro, who wrote The Power Broker, he did work that no other human's going to be able to do, right? As far as Lyndon B. Johnson's, the research on him, he went through all the documents, right? But there could be a future where that's a kind of thing between us and AI that it becomes much more easy to accomplish, and we can really understand what VR was like in 2021 versus 2023. So that has nothing to do with the technical constraints that you're working through. If there is a road forward, though, I would not be surprised to see it having something to do with an idea of process, an idea of agents as a kind of a process philosophy, right? So an agent, not necessarily an avatar of a particular person, like what would Licklighter do in this situation, but more like Licklighter plus this problem plus this context equals a series of claims, or observations. And you could take any one of those and kind of reverse engineer and find your path through a library that way. All that to say is I'd love to hear your other thoughts, or even just point me to something. I guess I'll check out the South by talk.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear more about the process philosophy.
Yeah, I'll add a link that eventually we'll have all the process philosophers in there in the text that is from the. I don't have them all tagged quite yet, but if I go to Voices of VR and just I'll add in the link. So if I go there, it's under ideas and philosophy. Some of them are there, and then I'll be adding more. So this link here. Now I'm finally able to the point where I'm able to just send you a link.
Great.
I'll have to go back and add more, but the interview that I did with Matt Siegel and then Grant Maxwell, I did a previous interview with Siegel here. I'll just add that in, Whitehead. Okay, so this episode 965 that I did with Matt Siegel was like sort of an introductory primer that I haven't got back that far yet, but those other links will sort of give you a sense. So process philosophy, I think one of the things about process philosophy is that you don't see things as static objects. So if you were to say, what would Licklighter think about this? But there's different phases of people's thoughts of how they evolve over time and how their perspective shifts. And it also shifts relative to what's happening in the context. And so this process relational mode of thinking is thinking about how do things sort of evolve and grow over time, and not just one static, thought of like trying to take all of the entirety of the corpus of everything they ever said, but is there an evolutionary trajectory to that? So I think the thing that you mentioned around like things being started and things being dropped, I've done some interviews with math. I've actually done interviews. I have enough interviews, around 1,000 or 1,500 interviews around artificial intelligence, mathematics, philosophy, decentralization, esoteric topics of consciousness. And so there's like a whole like 7 other podcasts that I could dig into that is part of my limitation of just one Voices of VR, but there's all these other topics that I've sort of looked into, and that maybe part of the future that I have is like taking this taxonomy term and being able to intermingle these different domains of like AI with VR. Or maybe it'll all just be one podcast eventually. But right now, it's like overwhelming, just what I'm already producing. But I did go to mathematics conferences and talk to history of mathematics, and I've done maybe around 100 interviews or so with different mathematics folks looking at the philosophy of mathematics. And one of the things about the history of math is that there'll be things that start in math, but they'll be like but those loose ends are still potentially valid hundreds of years later. And so they'll be digging through, like, math is one of the few topics that will have a history track at a math conference that is just as relevant as any other track, because there's things that may be developed in the mathematical toolbox that, famous mathematicians of the past have developed, and they have their notebook and they're digging through it. Maybe something that they're thinking about is applicable to combining with something else to understand what is happening today. So when I talk to folks who are into the history of math, they say you can't always say what the victory is and just look at the things that led up to that. you have to look at all of the loose ends that was started and dropped. And that's basically what I've got with the Voices of VR, is a bunch of failed projects that started but just didn't take off. Maybe that's a bad idea and it'll never take off. Maybe it just wasn't the right time for that to take off. And maybe it requires some other new context like Apple Vision Pro with other cloud rendering and other 5G, like the live streaming applications that were out there. They were trying to replicate Twitch and VR, but it just wasn't ready. The market size wasn't ready. So that doesn't mean that we're not going to have this type of immersive live streaming. It just means that maybe it just wasn't time. And so what were the lessons that were from these startups that were doing that? And so that's part of the, history. The value of history is to capture these conversations as it's unfolding, because we don't know what's going to be like the killer app that's already been made, but it just wasn't time. And maybe it just requires a new context later. So that's part of like the value of trying to capture an archive like this, is to have those conversations so that maybe someone listens to something where it was a right idea, but at the wrong time. And maybe they'll get like, hey, now it's the right time and let's try it this way or try something different. So that's like, as this kind of historical view, that's the value of creating something like this, is because just because things didn't pan out and become the next biggest startup and they actually folded and failed for a number of reasons, that doesn't mean that that's not going to be a part of the ecosystem in 5, 20, or 100 years from now. So that's sort of, I take that approach for how I do what I do, and what are the ways that people can start to discover some of those different insights through listening to those conversations. And maybe just like the math, it's still relevant. I think there's a lot of that I've captured that has historical relevance, but also insights and perspectives about the medium that maybe no one else has articulated before. And it'll just take someone else listening to that to then be able to connect the dots and then kind of unlock their own creative potential for what they want to create in VR.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It took us a long time to get to the point that capturing the people is really, really important. The data is one thing, but their parents, their face, their intonation is also really valuable for posterity, which I'm sure will look beautiful in virtual environments when they can be presented properly. Over to Leon.
Yeah, thanks. I really like the idea of fails, which later turn out to be a win, actually. And it basically comes back to the relational dynamics you were talking about, that, yeah, we can make relationships at a certain point in time, but later it can turn out there were a lot of other relationships too, which we didn't know about yet or didn't see. And I also wanted to ask a small question based on Mark Anderson's really good feedback. He was talking about loose coupled or making it more loose coupled. And as far as I understood, the idea was to not look at things through the lens of WordPress tags and categories. But to add to that, I think the interface to how you manage it is also very powerful, or has been very powerful so far. I mean, you have a huge amount of content, so obviously the interface seems to be very good so far. So I was thinking maybe maybe you could go for a hybrid approach where you have this, let's say, core layer, and maybe I'm now creating some kind of monster system, but like WordPress is the core, and then on top of that, maybe you have looked into WordPress plugins, which, for example, allow you to manage and inject JSON LD snippets. I don't know if you have looked
I haven't seen that.
into
What do you mean by, what are those JSON snippets doing?
So JSON LD is basically, it allows you to create small sort of JSON snippets in the HTML. It's a finer grained metadata. Google also reads it. So for example, if in a Google search, if you see suddenly sometimes you see a small form or a picture, that's basically, it means that that website was actually offering a JSON LD snippet in the page. And there's also a JSON LD object for podcasts, which allows you also to specify a specific time in the podcast, and also a spatial location for New York or or whatever, and about the person and all these things you can do there. But in the chat, I also read some people who said, like Mark, that maybe it's a bit more effort. So that's why I was thinking perhaps there is a plugin for that.
It's effort with payoff. It seems like effort on the front end, but once you have that, your ability to do, sorry to jump in, but your ability to do some of the things you want becomes easier. Because whether you're using it for your own interface of your own website, for instance, or just being able to give very granular, extremely rich so RSS or JSON feeds, all these things. I say that because it will, especially if it's not your immediate sort of field, it'll seem like hard work, but I really do think it pays off. And I made a similar content just below the same thing about, APA is a print format, nothing wrong with it. Great for a screen render, not how you want to store it, because maybe no one else actually uses APA. And then they've got to take it and turn it back into something usable. So if you store it as something generally usable, but as I say, yeah, it definitely feels like hard work. So it's worth making that point. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, right now I have like the output of WhisperX are SRT files. And like I've already said, the SRT files are not as useful as they are. If you, I'll post the one example that I have up on my website right now, if people want to look. And hopefully after this, like as soon as later today, I'll try to like have so that all of the ones that I have so far will be like rough transcripts, because I have it on a dev site, but you can look at that as an example that I showed that has the ability to kind of click on a link and go specifically to that time. So the SRT file has like these chunks, and there was a Python script that I had to do that says detect every time there's a speaker change and basically collapse all of those into one chunk of text with a time code. And so when I'm doing that, I'm already adding a bit of JavaScript onto that time code to be able to seek to that. So it wouldn't be as much of an additional thing to add an additional JSON object at that point, to whatever, if there's a customized format to basically say, seek to this, whatever that, I have to see what that format is. And but I'm already processing the SRT file and automatically generating this HTML. It may be just a matter of programmatically adding additional text to add a little bit more JSON in there, because right now it's just a giant text blob. So I can add whatever I want in there. And it's detecting and being triggered on speaker changes. So I'm already doing some processing. It may be something that's just another thing that I'm adding, depending on what it is that I'm trying to do. Like I said, the search functionality is going to also drive some of this. And so it may be like, maybe, having the text as output is good, but maybe there's another thing that has like the speaker separated from the text that allows like an advanced search to say, search for very specifically, like, if there's labels to those speakers, all of the architects and what they say about something. So there may be ways where the advanced search is able to have that additional advanced custom fields to drive that with certain searches. I think that the existing way that the categories and tags are implemented in WordPress already is fairly loosely coupled, meaning that it's at the higher level of the podcast. It's and there's multiple tags and categories, but the conversation spans all those categories, but not all at once. It sort of jumps around. And this is based upon my memory of stuff too. So basically, like as I go further and back, I'll see what my memory is about these different conversations and how to robustly the tagging will be. But the point is that the tagging and the categories already are providing me both a navigational functionality for people to search, and I'm just able to, like I sent the link to all of philosophy interviews that I've done. And the tags also have that. And so the tags and the categories, because they have RSS feed functionality, it already makes them useful. Even if you don't think that tags are generally useful, because it has an RSS feed. If I have a tag that says Apple, and if someone wants to listen to all the podcasts that I have for Apple, that's useful. So it already has a utility enough for me to consider tags. It's just a matter for me of what is going to be revealed in the higher level hierarchy of the menu navigation, what's going to be in a giant tag cloud with all this other information that may be generally available, so that if I want to send people a link to all of this, say, brain-computer interface interviews that I have a half dozen of that doesn't warrant a full tag of the category, that may still be extremely useful for that person. So yeah, like I said, it's going to be dictated through as I start to just kind of say, hey, this might be useful to my audience. What do people want? And then that's going to sort of, as I start to engage folks, that's going to drive the development. And as I've been doing all this work, kind of driving more support to my Patreon, just to kind of provide this as a service and have people like, what are people willing to pay for? Are there things that are pay gated? Or is this just a general tool that I'm making available for free completely? Or is the advanced search, as an example, is that something that would be behind a paywall because that is going to take additional work? Or, I want to be this, like, what's going to be the valuable for the users? And also, like, how do I make what is essentially where I'm giving everything away for free? How do I sustain myself as an independent scholar doing all this stuff, and get to a sustainable level with my career? And balancing that is something that I'm in the process of trying to figure out. But I'm just sort of happy to have the opportunity to just talk about some of this stuff to this group, because I think you're thinking about a lot of the same things. And it's great to hear like tool references, but also just to have you aware that I'm thinking about this problem. And if you want examples of some of the different WhisperX scripts or more details about some of the stuff of my workflow to be able to get to this point, I'm happy to also share that offline.
So I'll have to run away in a minute, but I also want to thank you, Ken, for presenting and for hosting. And I think it is very valuable. I will just give one personal advice before I run away is to cherish that moment, Ken, when, for example, you said just minutes ago that you were finally able to send a link with the category and then the episodes there. It is something that happened to me a couple of years ago with my wiki, where I was able to create a page, and that page has also anchors and whatnot. But basically having something both for others and for myself, because I was able to pinpoint with one URL some ongoing work. And it's just, we talk a lot about the technical stuff, and it is important because that's how make it happen, basically. But the emotional part, like how intellectually it makes us feel like empowered, basically, I think it's not something we just really touch on too often, but I think it's extremely precious, because in the end, that's okay, we have yet another idea, cool, but how having yet another idea make us feel, how being able to share it with everyone, and I think it's extremely, extremely precious. So thanks again, and gotta run.
See you later, Fabian.
Yeah, thanks, Fabian. And I also just shared a link that has the feed to it. So when you click on that link, you can actually subscribe to it on an RSS reader, and hopefully you can just listen to it into your podcast. So you can just sort of listen to them, take that link and start to just put it into your podcatcher and just listen to all the philosophy interviews I've done so far. And as I go back and continue to add those tags, there'll be more that shows up in the past. But yeah, I love being able to just send a link now rather than like a bunch of links. And I think that's the type of thing where that's the utility for me, to be like, oh, here's a link that you can go to, and then you can subscribe to it and then listen to a bunch of the stuff. Then the question becomes, okay, how do people find and discover that? And maybe that's where the XR starts to come in, where they can start to discover enough of a clips or excerpts or something where there's enough of a snippet where people discover something that they want to listen to and dig into more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I want to second Fabian's thank you for you coming here. Absolutely. Also, we do have these sessions every Monday, same time, and you're very welcome to come and be part of any of the discussions. We are kind of the other way around in a sense. We're obviously text first, ostensibly, but of course, this is not text what we're doing now. So there is this tug between the different media, which is interesting. Which we're dealing with different ways, as you can see on our websites, but also something that I mentioned at the very beginning of today that Leon and I have been emailing a bit about is the whole idea of copy and paste. The clipboard should not be ignored. One of the things with Visual Meta, there's a link to that higher up, is when you copy from a PDF to a word processing document, you copy as a intelligent citation. So that means everything happens magically for you. I'm wondering if in the media we're talking about here, how that can be extended. One of the things we have already discussed is, of course, how we can store spatial information in a copy. And what that means, Apple have now made their Vision OS available, so they have their windows, spaces, and environment. So they're beginning to define for us what space means in VR, which is, of course, practically good, but imagination-wise, maybe not so good. So I would be very interested. When I earlier said, how can I cite you? I meant that in many ways. It would be really worthwhile for our two parallel communities to be able to refer to each other's work. I would love to be able to put a thing in a document that connects to one of your things. So maybe that's
Yeah.
something that can be discussed in the future.
Yeah, and I'm very much open to adding, like I said, API because APA referencing because that's how I have been doing presentations. But I have seen in like archive and even on the bottom of your specific like with the brackets, and I don't know if there's a name for like a way to generalize that, like Mark was saying, that then sort of generates all the different types of citation formats. I happen to use APA because that's what a lot of academics end up using. And so I prefer that as I use Citation Machine to then generate these citations.
Yeah, but here's the key thing that Mark was meaning. That is, these types of citations are kind of like web links as well.
Yeah.
Because I'm currently so with this kind of testing, on one hand side you have the academic need for certain styles, which obviously need to be respected, but there's also the opportunities and the affordances of better linking. So that's the different things we're looking into. How, for instance, with the visual meta system, if you're reading a document and there is a citation in the hard bracket, you click on it, and this is Mark Anderson's idea, you get the full reference information come up in a pop-up. And we've gone further because the expectation is that in your community, you will probably download all the relevant documents to your work. So if you click on the title, if you have the document, it'll open to the correct page. These are the sorts of things that should be obvious, but they aren't yet. Now, how much further can we go, not only into the sound and moment of a podcast, but also once you start to spatialize that, I could imagine, maybe you have the people in a room. How do you refer to that? That's what I mean by how do you cite it?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think right now, so I'd love to, first of all, hear or get any links to some of these different formats that you think are recommended in terms of how to start to, like, you've developed your own citation method, but if there's also other things that would be helpful to include into these documents to help folks like yourself cite things. Right now, SRT formats are very specific with a begin and end time. And then when I compress it so that it's readable, it makes it so it's the beginning of someone speaking, which I find is for me, the most useful to both present to people because you hear the beginning of what they're saying if you need to seek. But it also has a possibility of that time code is a very specific number that can be turned into something that is essentially like an addendum to a URL, that if you have a URL, then that URL could then take that and then put it into the MEX or whatever, like my specific website is able to potentially open up that. I already have JavaScript there. I could click on that button and it starts to play it. So it may be just a matter of saying, okay, is that able to be put at the URL level so that it could actually be a URL that you're citing, that when people click on it, they just like YouTube has it. So that's something I just have to investigate in terms of citation, but also these other citation formats, like what are ways of adding whatever the other metadata are to be able to help seek to these specific moments. So as I'm generating these automated processes, I'm more than happy to kind of experiment with adding some of this, especially if there's other people that are trying to figure out how to cite it. Because I think that's part of the motivation here is I have created this big legacy of content, but it's been inaccessible for anyone who hasn't listened to it. So if there's text, it just helps reveal specific things that I've already done and makes it so people can search it, find it, and cite it. So
absolutely. And yeah, thank you for today. We're out of time. It was a good 2 hours, but please feel free to come back anytime and email with us or do what you can. Your corpus and your work is amazing. We are moving more and more into VR, at least as a huge part of what we are doing. So it's, yeah, it's really interesting stuff. So have a good rest of the week and see many of you in a week. Bye, guys.
thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, great chat.
Have a great week.